But thank you all for joining this evening. Obviously, I think this is an incredibly important conversation to be having. I'm very invested in feminist foreign policy as an idea. And kind of like what Pascal said, I think, you know, foreign policy can be very serious, can be very stuffy and boring sometimes. But one of the reasons why I love feminist foreign policy is that it just breathes this new life into what foreign policy can be. And we can engage with these very intense and heavy subjects, but we can also have fun and find joy while we do it. So I really love like that particular angle to this work. So I'm one of the co-founders of CFFP, as mentioned, and we are a research and advocacy organization explicitly working on feminist foreign policy and kind of both working with countries that already have a feminist foreign policy and then hopefully convincing a couple others to adopt one as well, and kind of trying to figure out what all of that means as we go down that route, as it's such a new idea. So I think before I truly dive in, I also want to make note that as we are in the middle of a global pandemic, I think considering how policy can be oriented towards helping those who are the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, which to me is the point of feminist foreign policy, now more than ever is just the most important thing we could be doing. And, you know, kind of traditionally, foreign policy is very militarized and largely focused on national security. And these mainstream ideas of national security is just so weapons heavy. And we keep peace by threatening violence and threatening ultimate destruction. And in my opinion, that isn't actually keeping the peace. We need to be flipping these ideas of security on their head and instead consider, you know, not how do we make a state quote unquote secure, but instead how do people become insecure in the first place? And that kind of reframes the issue of security as something that comes down to much more, you know, kind of everyday basic needs like housing or food or access to healthcare. So anyways, that's kind of the perspective with which I'm approaching this. In terms of the format, I will chat for about 15 minutes. Leave a tiny bit of time at the end for a question or two. So of course, this is going to be kind of like, you know, dipping our toe in the pool in terms of what I can cover in 15 minutes. So if you don't get the opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A, you can always drop me a line on Twitter or Instagram as well. I love talking about this stuff with people. My handle is Marissa Conway. Yeah, so let's dive in. I am focusing on kind of these three different locations of feminist foreign policy for this kind of overview, because I think when we talk about feminist foreign policy, it's very important to be mindful of whose feminist foreign policy are we talking about. I think ultimately, you know, kind of ultimately feminist foreign policy is a state agenda. It means it's a specific political framework that a state has adopted to determine how it's going to structure its foreign policy. But I think what that framework should be or should include or should not include is still very much up for debate. And this is where engagement with academia and activists is incredibly important. I don't think, while I think we can have successful feminist policies, I do not think the state can necessarily be a feminist actor. So there will always be some degree of kind of watering down its quote unquote feminist work, a bit of co-optation, because ultimately it's still functioning within these really patriarchal structures. So we can kind of celebrate how incredible it is to see states adopting explicitly feminist policies or feminist foreign policies, but also acknowledge that, you know, these are in their infancy and there's still a lot of room for growth and some work. But I'll start with the state because that's where it kind of all got kicked off. Before I dive in, I want to just cover these two terms. They probably are familiar to many of you, but just to make sure we're on the same page in kind of approaching these ideas around feminism in general. The first is intersectionality. So this is a definition I grabbed from the Oxford reference. And in short, intersectionality means that you have to take multiple social categories into account when you're doing feminist work. So gender alone is not going to give you enough of a big picture view as to how to combat discrimination. And I think in particular, there's a focus on the different lived realities, and there's a hesitancy to try and go towards any sort of universalisms at all, because I think when we do tend to talk about women or gender, even the default still tends to err on the side of white women, and race and class are often kind of forgotten. Also, this was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, just to give her full cred. The next one is postcolonialism, which grapples with colonial legacies. This is another Oxford bibliography definition here that I grabbed. Obviously, there are many, many different definitions, many different interpretations. This is the super bullet point version. But in short, post-colonial theory, as it says, just really grapples with the political, economic, social consequences of European colonial rule. I would argue colonial rule in general, because not all colonial rule happened out of Europe. Obviously, this particular definition is taking a Europe focus. But those two will kind of frame the discussion as I continue to talk about feminist foreign policy. So this is Margot Wallström. She's the former foreign minister of Sweden, and she was the one to kind of lead on feminist foreign policy and announce it in 2014 when Sweden officially adopted it. Their feminist foreign policy revolves around 3 R's, which are rights, representation, and resources. And their feminist foreign policy agenda really focuses on women and girls, and is also very externally focused. So there's a huge disconnect between domestic policy and foreign policy in this sense. And I truly believe what Sweden is doing is actually incredibly transformative. And the way that they have kind of shifted the mandate of the foreign ministry in order to adapt these feminist principles is truly astounding. However, again, because this is such an externally focused agenda, I think that self-reflexivity that is really fundamental to feminism is kind of lost. And if Sweden were to more closely link their feminist foreign policy with the rest of their political system and agenda, they would have to confront things like their arms exports, their reluctance to sign the nuclear ban treaty, their kind of broken immigration system. So I also want to caution around an agenda that is kind of generically focused on women and girls, and there isn't much of an intersectionality located within their particular approach to this. So there's very little, if none, reference to race, class, sexuality, etc. So simply because Sweden was the first, the majority of feminist foreign policies that have followed suit are likewise very specifically focused on women and girls, and do tend to kind of parallel what Sweden has done. I would say they focus more on addressing the symptoms of inequality than the root causes. So the way state feminist foreign policies are formulated, it doesn't necessarily demand for institutional reform. So I think this is, again, why it's incredibly important to be connecting these ideas with academics and activists as well in the work that they're doing to really push this envelope forward. Here's a quick timeline of what everybody is doing with feminist foreign policy. The most recent one, which just happened last week, Hawaii launched their Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, which actually is incredibly like decolonial and anti-racist and amazing and anti-capitalist. I highly recommend taking a look at that. Okay, I'm gonna power through because I feel like I'm running out of time already. I feel like this is kind of the core belief that the activists I know doing this work have about feminist foreign policy. So it's a belief that foreign policy does have the potential to be a means for feminist values like equality, justice, solidarity, and ultimately peace. And I think this kind of optimism is what fuels us, even though foreign policy is typically this incredibly violent institution. We see how it can potentially be a force for good if it were done in a more feminist way. Just to give a couple quick definitions of how activists would define feminist foreign policy, it's very intersectional, much more concerned with kind of structures and power dynamics. So with the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, my organization, here's kind of how we would interpret these things. So we tend to focus on these kind of structures like patriarchy, colonization, heteronormativity, capitalism, racism, etc., and how gender, race, class, sexuality interplays with these things. So we very quickly get moved away from just a focus on women and girls, or even just a focus on gender, but try and really take this big picture look at power. Another organization doing work on feminist foreign policy is ICRW, and very similarly, they are focused more on trying to draw out this intersectional understanding of feminist foreign policy and looking at things like race, ethnicity, disability, class, refugee status. A third organization doing work on this is one called Intersectional Feminist Foreign Policy in the UK, and says it in the name again, they have a very intersectional approach of elevating marginalized voices, and not just focusing on women, but taking a more holistic look at what feminist engagement can mean. In the academic sphere, there is perhaps not as radical as definitions as activists have, but a lot of theoretical work to kind of build out what I would argue is almost like a shift in mentality around foreign policy, because I think this really realpolitik understanding of Western politics in general, and this insistence on like very neoliberal ideas, of course, leads to a lot of the things that a feminist foreign policy would critique and push back against. So kind of this third location within academia is really important too, to get that really rich research in. And these are a couple of the theories engaged that scholars have engaged with. It's still quite a small list because again, this is just such a new idea. And the names of a couple scholars that I totally recommend reading. We have a reading list on CFFP's website with all of these people on it. So if you really want to kind of get more into the theory behind it, definitely check that out on our site. I'm going to just take a quick look at this one particular article by Columba Achilio-Sarl that I am obsessed with. If you follow me on Instagram, I've been talking about it nonstop on my story for like the past 3 days, because I think, again, she hits this nail on the head. She's one of the few academics I've seen to go beyond gender and say that gender is actually privileged as this key social category when we're analyzing feminist foreign policy, but if we do that, we're still really limiting ourselves. And if we're trying to look at power dynamics and relations in a more comprehensive way, then we really need to be taking a very post-colonial and a very intersectional look to understand, both these hierarchies at a global level and also hierarchies at a more local level and how they interact and how they kind of reify each other. And I love this quote from her. I just wanted to throw this up here. So, post-colonial feminists would question the gendered, sexualized, and racialized discourses that are embedded within the neoliberal imperium, determining the process of foreign policy making, and thus opening up a space to investigate the underlying assumptions, narratives, and discourses that guide foreign policy decision-making. So this, to me, sums up very nicely why a post-colonial approach in particular, especially from like a theoretical level, is really crucial to creating a feminist foreign policy that is actually liberatory, emancipatory, radical, something that creates system changes and doesn't just push a bit of funding towards girls' education, which is important, but that's not the only thing that you got to do if you're going to have a feminist foreign policy. The last thing I want to flag is, as you break out into your groups to discuss where feminist foreign policy should go over the next 10 years, I love this set of questions to help frame how to bring a feminist analysis into any issue area. So I know you kind of have like there's already a guide and everything, but I would definitely recommend keeping these 4 questions in the back of your head as you have these conversations. So who has power? Who doesn't have power? Why is this the case? And then how can this be changed? And I feel like that's a really easy way to start framing something kind of in this feminist mindset. So I want to plug that. Big fan of these 4 questions. Whew, I feel out of breath now. I think hopefully I'll get back out of my screen share mode and answer 1 or 2 questions if there is time, but if not, that's my social media handle, so drop me a line and I'm happy to keep chatting. And now let's see how smoothly I can manage this.
Take your time.
Thank you. Oh my God, I have absolutely no idea what's going on right now.
Click on that.
Okay,
yeah, here we go. There you are. Thanks so much.
I made it. Thank you.
Deep breath. That was amazing. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think we couldn't have had a better introduction, kind of, getting us in the mind space that is necessary for these breakout groups. We've had a couple of some of the participants have been a bit shy, but we did get a couple of questions, and I think I'll start off with a question posed by Clarice. Thanks, Clarice, for posing your question. And the question was related to a post-colonial perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So she's asking concerning post-colonial countries, what are the main policy differences to expect to be applied in a case of a feminist foreign policy turn, such as, for example, in Mexico, comparing to, European examples that we're already seeing now?
Mm-hmm. I think feminist foreign policy has to be very context specific, because I think there's also a risk of, one of the things it's really trying to do is grapple with these colonial legacies and imperialist tendencies from Western countries onto lower middle income countries. So I don't really have an easy answer, because I feel like they will look very, very different. That I know for sure. And I think it's important that those policies be developed within those countries. Mexico is going to be a very interesting one to watch, because it's the first global South country to have adopted a feminist foreign policy. So I feel like in that sense, they are going to, as Sweden has sort of set the standard for just all states to follow, in a sense, Mexico, I think, has set the standard for global South countries to follow. And so I hope that this can be a really interesting site of disruption of this kind of imperialist dynamic within foreign policy. And I worry that it will be imperialism repackaged with a nice feminist bow.
Yeah. So you're talking about context. What would some of the specific differences, like concrete examples of differences, be? For example, talking about Mexico.
So in thinking about, the UK, which is the context I know the best, it's a nuclear possessing nation. So obviously their feminist foreign policy, which they don't have, but Labour has talked very openly about adopting it. The Women's Equality Party has pledged to adopt it. So theoretically, whenever we may get away from a Tory government, there is a very good chance that under a Labour government, we could have a feminist foreign policy. So just to kind of frame it, there are different power dynamics within different countries. A nuclear possessing nation, their feminist foreign policy will look very different and probably be much more focused on disarmament and Security Council things and multilateral institutions. And I would argue Mexico's, I would say, still pretty similarly mirrors Sweden's in terms of its focus on women and girls. But Mexico has really struggles with femicides and domestic violence rates. And I think even though that's domestic policy, from what I've been hearing from activists in Mexico, the current feminist foreign policy is sort of sidestepping that a little bit. But what civil society wants is for it to directly engage with that particular piece of this domestic issue. Yeah. So yeah, it'll kind of shift around. But I would say on the whole, there's just so much emphasis on sort of saving the women and girls over there. We're going to go help them over there. So I think I see a lot of activists being like, let's bring it back. How can we start focusing on these things in our own country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. So I'm seeing a couple more questions. Pascal, do we have time for another one?
Yeah, sure. Let's go for one more.
Okay, so here we go. Question, do you think, oh, now there are lots of them. Let me just scan through. Or Marissa, if you'd like, I mean, you can see the chat. You can also have a quick peek. I was going to just ask the one that was posed first, which is, what do you think about enhancing the percentage of women participating in peacekeeping operation in both levels, uniforms, diplomacy tracks, etc.? In accordance with 1325, of course.
Yeah. So yeah, I didn't mention 1325. This is Security Council Resolution 1325, which I think was 2000, if I'm remembering correctly. Someone, if I'm wrong, just say so. And it was the first resolution to explicitly connect like women with peace building. So it became very impactful, particularly on policies dealing with representation. I think there are two interesting points to make. Representation is incredible and it's very important. Because of this different life experiences thing, this to me is why we need more diversity in political leadership, or just, you know, in general in peacekeeping and diplomacy and all of these different fields, because simply because people have different life experiences, they're going to bring different things to the table. They're going to bring different perspectives, opinions. And I think, you know, with my hat on of policy making in particular, like, surely we want a diverse range of thoughts and opinions when we're making huge decisions about, you know, what are the conditions upon dropping a nuclear bomb on another country. Like, we don't want the same old white men sitting in a room all agreeing with each other. Like, we want, hopefully, I want really intense discussions around this, and I want people to put in the effort to figure out what's the best way forward that isn't, I'm really shitting on old white men right now, but that's just where my brain's going right now. So representation, amazing. Not all women are feminists, and I think that's a very important distinction to make. Men also can be feminists. Also, gender nonconforming people can be feminists. So I think there are two different things where we've got just an increase in diversity, increase in women's representation, but an increase in feminists in politics is also, I think, something that looks very different, and it's much more oriented around a person's specific value set than just their identity, their gender identity. I think both are really necessary, but I also think it's important not to like conflate the two. Yeah, it's complicated. I think it's a complicated one, but I think it's really, really interesting. Hopefully that was helpful.